Good morning. Welcome to the worship service of the First Unitarian Church of Hobart. My name is Barb Langle, and I participate in the life of the church by serving on the Board of Trustees, among other things. We are a religious community of people with diverse beliefs and shared values. Our diverse beliefs are expressed in our 6 sources, and our shared values are expressed in our 7 principles. Both can be found online at uua.org. Together, we strive to grow spiritually, build community, and live our values in the world. I have a few announcements. The first one is February 12th, right after service, is our chili cook-off. You could sign up. There's a sign-up board if you want to bring the chili and enter on the counter. And if you want to come in and vote for the best chili, it's $5, and you get a bowl, and that bowl you can go back and forth as many times as you want. Okay? Faith in Action is collecting men's coats, pants, jeans, and sneakers to be released to the prisoners. Through the end of February, we'll be collecting all sizes of gently worn men's coats, pants. These donations will be given to St. Aline Brown at Westville Correctional Facility. What they have now is their supply is very low. If there is anybody that would like to help get the rest of the Christmas decorations downstairs right after the service, I'd really appreciate it. And Cindy has a few words.
Thanks, Barb. Sure. Last week, I told you about an exciting opportunity. On Saturday, February the 11th, a bus will travel from Northwest Indiana to join over 800 people of faith and goodwill from across the state to demand a fully funded mental health crisis response system in our state at the Call for Care rally in Indianapolis. Now, those of you know me, now I used to be a teacher, so for those of you who missed class last week, I'm gonna do a quick review of what I said. At that time, I announced, and this is good news, I'll start. IAN, Interfaith Action Network, of which we are a part, secured a $1.5 million allotment to pilot a mobile mental health crisis pilot program in Gary. Yeah. Yes, we were a part of that. I also informed you of statistics regarding the need for such services across our state. I shared my own personal story of why this work is important to me. I reminded us of our collective responsibility and call as Unitarian Universalists to live our values in the world, and I gave details. We are going to meet at 7:45 on February the 11th at McBride Hall in Gary, and we'll depart sharply at 8:15. Lunch and snacks will be provided, and we'll return by 5:30. You don't have to ride a bus, but that's our gathering point. So, show of hands, how many of you have decided to answer that call for care and join me on that day? Woo, look at us, yay! Leave your hands in the air and raise your hand if you're wondering, hey, is this trip for you? Raise your hand if you are someone who is interested in mental health care response, interested in participating in racial coalitions and interfaith work, interested in joining with like-minded people for a day of travel, training, and meeting with officials. Hey, there's your answer. Please help us fill the bus and show up in Indianapolis where we can make a difference. And if you want more information, I get a flyer made by our own Kaylin Du Bois. See me after church. Thank you.
We are currently streaming our services online. The joys and sorrows portion of our service, however, is private, and we will take a break during that portion. Other than that, the service will be recorded and will be available for future viewing on Facebook, YouTube, and the church website. Wearing masks is optional right now, but if you are ill or think you've had in contact with anyone who has had a virus, please attend virtually. Now please let your Facebook and Twitter friends know that you're attending worship with hashtag First Unitarian Hobart, and silence your devices and take a deep breath and another, and join us in the spirit of reverence.
If you would, join me in lighting the chalice. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We unite this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in a celebration of a life we share together.
First of all, thank you, Jeremy, for your beautiful prelude. It was very contemplative and relaxing. I felt myself just calming, listen to it. I appreciate you so much. Our opening words are by Judith Sargent Murray. If upon a return from any of your little visiting excursions, you should behold some beautiful addition to your apparel or some advantageous alteration in the disposition of the furniture of your chamber, you would take it for granted that the hand of affection had been employed, though you were not a spectator of its beneficent operations. So, when you behold the effects of love manifested in rain, sunshine, seed time, and harvest, you ought to conclude there is a power divine, thought to you invisible, and further that that power is all good, all gracious, and almighty. Please rise as you are willing and able in body and spirit, and join me in singing hymn number 1051 in the Teal hymnal, We Are.
We are
Now for our affirmation of faith. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. Service is its prayer. And this is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We are striving to keep a safe worship space which is both spiritual and safe. However, we recognize that not everyone can attend in person. We extend a special welcome to everyone who is joining us virtually today, and thank you for our tech team for making the streaming and recording possible. For those present in the sanctuary, please take a moment to greet your neighbor by waving your hands and letting the warmth of your smile fill the spaces between us.
Seated. Each week during our worship service, we invite folks to share the joys, the sorrows that are in your hearts, that are lifting you up or pulling you down, the milestones that we should all be carrying. And so in a moment, I'll come out with the microphone and invite folks to share that. But first, I just wanted to acknowledge the loss of a couple of folks in our congregation over this past week. Jen Wheatley, as those of you who were here last Sunday know that she died last week, as well as Laura Brooke. And so I just wanted to have... These past few weeks, we've been digging into the stories of some Unitarians and Universalists from years past. And this morning, we'll be digging into the story of Judith Sargent Murray a little bit. And so the story that I'll be sharing with you, I've adapted from Sheila Skemp's book about Judith Sargent Murray called First Lady of Letters. So she was around in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and for those of you who don't know, immediately after the Revolutionary War, there was an economic depression. And her uncle succumbed to smallpox at that time, and he died insolvent and left his wife a dependent upon the caprice and pride of an ungrateful world, in Murray's words. She inherited, her aunt inherited a little land and a house and not much else to be able to live on for the rest of her life. And so this was one particular window she had onto the economic situation of the day. But then there was also the situation with her first husband. She was married to this guy, John Stevens, and his fortunes kind of went up and down all the time. He was a businessman, and he suffered loss after loss, and he entered into these potentially very risky or lucrative, depending, privateering ventures. He was supremely confident in his abilities. He relished the adventure of getting to try out these different possibilities and seeing if he might be able to make some money for the family. He thrived on risk. He was enamored of fortune. And even before the war ended, this risky behavior put the family in some serious trouble. At one point, he owned parts of 10 vessels, all but 2 of which had either been captured by the enemy or lost at sea. And with peace, privateering was no longer an option, and so once again he plunged back into debt, and he borrowed money and sent his ships on legitimate ventures and ran into more than his share of bad luck and was soon in danger of losing everything. But as always, he was confident. He assured Judith before he left home that she had nothing to worry about. And so she was both surprised and worried when she opened a letter to him that demanded immediate payment of a loan that she had never heard of. In one particular year, John lost 5 times more than he owed. And Judith started worrying through the winter of how they were going to cover things. And her health started to take a downturn. She became more frail, and possibly her fears of their economic circumstances fed into that. She was left at the mercy of her husband's fortune in a society where the wife was considered part of the whole with the husband. And so John mortgaged their house to his father-in-law in order to protect it from creditors coming by and trying to steal their house. And he assured her that more lucrative voyages were in the offing. So Judith enjoyed her last all too brief respite from the financial disasters that characterized so much of her marriage to John Stevens, relying on his assurances that fortunes were coming back in. She once again started inviting guests over to their house. But it was short-lived as the suspense and the looming creditors started to take their toll. She called it painfully corroding. And so she felt more and more helpless the more she learned of the situation they were actually in, as she started to write letters to his creditors asking him if they might give permission for him to set sail out to the Caribbean to try to earn some more money. Judith had begun to feel as though she had committed some dark crime, and she saw her home as less a refuge than a prison. She could not bear to be the object of her neighbor's scorn or pity, and she suspected that even some Universalists were secretly gloating at the mortifying circumstances of the once proud Mrs. Stevens. Thus, she quit going to church, dreading the inquisitive gaze of the indifferent or censorious that emanated from the faces of her purported friends. The short trip to her parents had become an ordeal. She took to visiting home after night fell so that she could avoid every curious eye. She locked, bolted, and barred the front door and slept with the keys to the house hidden beneath her pillow. She refused to open the door unless she was positive that the visitor on the other side was not another creditor. She was so distraught that when her own father came to the house, she refused to let him in, sure that someone was imitating his voice in an effort to deceive her. The enemy, she told a friend, is constantly laying an ambush for our destruction. So after the revolution, it was just like before. Women in America operated within this common law tradition of coverture. And so in law, if not in reality, husband and wife were one person. He represented her political and economic interests. Her property was his. She couldn't sue or be sued. She couldn't enter into contracts without his permission. She was, in the parlance of the day, a femme couverte, and as such, she possessed no identity of her own. And the revolution did nothing to change this. The ideology of republicanism may have partially supplanted Puritan theology, but society continued to assume that wives had no separate interests, no will of their own. In the eyes of the law, married women were like privileged children, not responsible adults. And so she had to walk this sort of narrow tightrope, trying to support her husband without calling obvious attention to herself or interfering in inappropriate ways. And so she started taking on paying boarders, seeing if she could cover the bills in some other way. And eventually, John ended up setting sail without the permission of his creditors to the Caribbean to try to gather some more money. Made a few more business deals, which he promised her were going to end in fortune. And he ended up being put into debtor's prison and dying in the Caribbean, leaving his wife a widow, and her to handle all of the money affairs that he had left unresolved. From these particular circumstances, much wisdom was pulled forth, which we'll get into in the sermon. I invite you to open your teal hymnals to hymn number 1002, Comfort Me. Rise in body or spirit and join in song.
Comfort me.
seated. So we are in the final week of this series on our Unitarian Universalist forebears. In a previous series, we focused more on going inside and contemplation and attending to your relationship with yourself and to one another. And in this series, we're focusing a bit more on outward motion, on how are you showing up in the world, on what actions are you taking in the wider context that we exist in. And this arises out of a different ways of thinking about what it means to be Unitarian Universalist. So when you talk about what it means to be Christian or Buddhist or Hindu, we can look at sacred texts like the Bible or the Tao Te Ching or whatever else. We can look at what are the beliefs, what are the institutions. One thing that we can focus on is the people, the ancestors that came before us. And so that's the focus of this series. The first week we talked about George de Benneville, who had this experience of Muslims being so loving that it called into question his own spirituality and practice, his own understanding of how he could show up in the world. It shifted the whole course of his life. And so my invitation to you that week was to offer an unbounded moment of love to someone without the expectation of return, and to see what comes of that. The second week, we talked a little bit about Charles Chauncey, who was this paradox of being a traditionalist who paved the way for religious innovation, who reasoned himself out of his own orthodoxy, which ultimately led to the Unitarianism that we know being far more open and inclusive than he could have imagined it ever would be. And so the invitation that week was to think of a spiritual practice that might take you deeper than what you even currently believe to be true. And this past week, we talked about Margaret Fuller, who talked about, or who had this experience of tying together her head and her heart, and needing to do that within the gendered rules of her society. And so my invitation to you was in our day, in our context, what might it mean for you to weave together your own head and heart? And this week we'll be talking about Judith Sargent Stevens Murray and what she gleaned from life. I talked in previous sermons about my own period of atheism, of really delighting in songs like Dear God, which was originally put together by XTC and covered by Sarah McLachlan, where she ends the song with, "If there's one thing I don't believe in, it's you." And the song Heresy by 9 Inch Nails, where he talks about God, if God is dead and no one cares, if there is a hell, I will see you there. There's a very aggressive way of that stance to that I very much identified with. But I got to this point in life in college where I was asked to reflect on my spirituality, and I thought back on my experiences of Unitarian Universalism, looking for some answer to what that might be, and then I thought of this experience of circle worships when I was a teenager going to youth conferences, where we would gather around 11 at night, maybe in the chapel in a church or maybe at a campground, and experience a sort of togetherness that I would later find out was rooted in neo-paganism. But at the time, it was just an experience of presentness with everybody there. An experience that my cognitive, my intellectual understandings of the world couldn't quite capture. It broke out of my own framework for how the world was actually put together. And I had to reach back, this was 10 years later on of me reaching back to my previous experience and finding that it didn't line up with the categories that I was putting the world in. And that question, that seed, ended up being the starting point for me, ended up going to seminary and becoming a minister. So has there been something in your life where you've reached a particular place and you realize that the pieces don't quite fit? That there's some way that you've thought about the world or the universe that made total sense maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and now being in this new place, the things actually don't add up the way that you thought that they might. And maybe there's a sense of uncertainty or disquietude or uneasiness in your belly when you get to that point. Or maybe there's a sense of, okay, that makes way more sense. It could be in the realm of politics. Maybe you shifted your politics, or maybe you got more radical or more conservative. Or maybe what's important to you just in your day-to-day existence, the flow of your day, how you get up in the morning, how do you go to bed at night, what nourishes you, what feeds you. As we evolve, as we grow, these things certainly shift and change, as they should. But there are those moments where there's a little crack in a larger story or edifice that causes it to break down, and a sea change starts to happen. Judith Sargent Stevens Murray wrote a series of a little over 30 essays that were published in periodicals at her time that she called The Gleaner. And she wrote them as if they were from the perspective of this guy whose title was The Gleaner. And it was about the things that he had gleaned, the things that he had picked up. And gleaning is this practice that is accepted in certain parts of the world where it's legally permissible to go around after the fields have been harvested and pick up the food that is still there, that is common property for all of us to use. And so it points to a different sort of economic arrangement than what we often think of in our capitalist context of buying and selling and what's yours and mine in our own houses. One of the things that I particularly appreciate about looking back to folks from the late 18th century is that it was this particular time before we started getting really deep into modernity. And I'm going to get maybe a little philosophical for some of you in terms of what modernity is. So I hope that everybody can just raise your hand if you're feeling confused, and I will try to say it in different words. But a big part of modernity was coming up with a big story for how everything fit together, for the totality of it, whether it's science or religion or any other bigger story about, this is how it all fits together. And so one of the challenges of our past 50 years is that these bigger narratives have started to break down and people have started to lose trust. And you could point to different things like maybe Watergate as being a piece of that, or just people finding that religion wasn't quite answering the questions that they wanted to, or there was all these unanswered questions in science. There's different ways that we can come to this thing of why have people lost faith in the larger, bigger narratives. But that has been a course that we've been on. And so it's interesting to me to think back to the folks in the late 18th century who were around just before those bigger narratives started to take shape, and how did they make meaning of their world in a more fragmented place. The two big storytellers of that time in the United States were Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton's big story was that the individual is subject to the market. In Hamilton's narrative, credit is the protagonist. People are the vehicles through which money moves, and human confidence in its representative function is what allows its circulation to continue. And so the credit is the main thing that we're all trying to dance around to make sure that it's working properly. In Jefferson's big narrative, the individual commands the market. And that's why in Jefferson's pastoral narratives, the large-scale economic relations that Hamilton's kind of gesturing to, of look at all these amazing things we can do if we could just let credit to flow. Jefferson tries to break it all down and simplify it into a story of an individual body that can be disentangled from the contingencies of the whole global market. This is in the words of scholar Elizabeth Hewitt. And so when you do this in Jefferson's version, it ends up hiding all the inputs and outputs of the market in order to hide how we are intertwined, how we are vulnerable to one another, how we impinge on each other through our own individual actions. It's this manufactured story that cultivates a fantasy of total autonomy, that we as the buyer can do whatever we like. So these are kind of two of the predominant narratives in America, these big stories that we find ourselves operating in terms of, whether we realize it or not. But there has been this breakdown. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, was distressed in the 20th century how he couldn't come up with a single anthropological approach to make everything work. It was a matter of picking up this toolbox in this context, and this toolbox in this context. And the same thing has happened in science. You can't quite square Newtonian understandings of how things work with Einsteinian understandings of how they work. They're two different rules. And so they've come up with this idea of string theory, of maybe we can have a whole grand narrative, but nobody's quite been able to prove string theory yet. It's still this striving towards a bigger narrative. And so all of this is part of why when people ask me, what is your theology? Are you a theist? Are you an atheist? Are you a Buddhist? Are you a Jew? Are you a Christian? My response is always that I have all these different maps. I have the Jewish map, I have the Christian map, I have the Buddhist map, I have the humanist map, and each of them have their strengths and weaknesses, and they can be brought into play in so many different ways. And so, Judith Sargent Murray, her story is different from those of Hamilton or Jefferson. In her writings of The Gleaner, she talks about us not being subject to the market at the service of credit, and not being at the command of the whole market and just getting to choose everything as the buyer, as the one in the marketplace. She picks up on her experience with her husband to talk about a world of particularity. What happens when you actually meet somebody that has their own context, their own experience of being in the world, their own human particularity, who's not just a piece of a larger story. In that experience of me looking back at the circle worship experience growing up Unitarian Universalist, it was when looking back at this one moment and allowing that one moment to recontextualize everything else. In her 100 essays that she ended up publishing about the Gleaner, she comes back again and again to each person interacting with one another and making requests and offering them to others and talking about their own problems and things that aren't working out well, and being willing to see all of these little breakdowns of society as signs of new ways of looking at things, new possibilities to see what unfolds. The downside of this is that there's not an easily repeated narrative. There's not the hero's journey that we can point to say, aha, here's the person rising from the bottom and reaching the top, which is similar to our challenge in Unitarian Universalism these days when we talk about, well, what exactly is Unitarian Universalism? And so we might point to the 7 principles as here's a way of summing it up. But that in its own way is its own sort of concise narrative to come back to, and it loses those particularities. And so my sermon today will necessarily be unsatisfying because it doesn't offer that narrative to you. It invites you into that process of making meaning in such a way that every moment of your life opens itself to you. Every moment of your life, when you sit with it and pay attention to it and listen to it, reveals something new. And I can't tell you what that meaning is. And that meaning is always under construction and always under evolution. But the beauty of Unitarian Universalism is that it doesn't have a set structure to it. That it is a path that we can walk together and we can encourage each other on, and we can listen. Oh, this is this revelation that you had from Wednesday last week. That's beautiful. This is what I discovered on Tuesday. Can I check in with you about that next week to see how this is evolving for you? And in that particularity with each other, we start to uncover a sort of humanness that gets so easily lost in our wider society today, when we're just thinking about the bigger, grander narratives. So I invite you into that dialogue with me, but even better with each other, to uncover some of that particularity and to make meaning of it. And so when you go to coffee hour today, if you want to get into some more casual conversation, that is totally permitted, but there is an additional invitation for you to pick on some particular experience that you had this past week and to offer it up to engage with each other, some small moment. Maybe it was how you stepped out your door one morning and saw the light hitting the trees in a particular way. Or maybe it was when you came home and met your spouse in the living room and saw some particular expression on their face and it had a particular meaning to it. Bringing those particularities into conversation with each other is what brings the richness of what Unitarian Universalism can be. And so that's my invitation to you this time around, as an extension of our religious heritage, to focus on these particulars of humanness with one another. In the midst of the river that is flowing within us and through us and on into the future, to continue this process of gradual evolution, taking heed of the real moment-to-moment existence in which we find ourselves, more than the bigger stories that our psychologies might create, to try to hold it all. So in that spirit, may we proceed into the future together.
Thank you, Pastor. Now is the time in our service for our offering. We give to remind ourselves of how many gifts we have to offer. We give to remember that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. We give because we believe in music and friendship. We give with the faith that together we have enough. The money in the baskets goes to sustaining the mission of our community. The money in the cups goes to our Faith in Action ministry and a different charity chosen by the ministry every month. This month, the money from the cups goes to the OWL organization, Our Whole Lives, that I think Pete, or Faith in Action, has talked about earlier this month. For those, to help youth in the community. For those not here with us today, there's an online link on the screen for both one-time and regular donations. And maybe could I have one more volunteer, please? For your prayers, your presence, your service, and your gifts, we are truly grateful. And now please rise as you're willing and able and join in singing the closing hymn, number 107, in the gray hymnal, There is a River Flowing in My Soul. I'm sorry, 1007. In the teal hymnal.
There's a river Now for our closing words. O spinner, weaver of our lives, your loom is love. May we who have gathered here be empowered by that love to weave new patterns of truth and justice into a web of life that is strong, beautiful, and everlasting.
Now to extinguish our chalice for the day, we extinguish His blood